I grew up on an island in Alaska, and I lived on the same property from birth to high school graduation. Our house was 2 stories, and the downstairs had a bathroom, furnace, storage, entryway, and rec room. One of the walls had some plywood pieces up, so we could feed extension cords through it up into our crawl space. We had a C-shaped driveway that you would enter from one side, then park in the carport and just drive forward to the exit. The crawl space consisted of 2 big water tanks because we caught our own rainwater. We also used this area for some storage. The space was 10 by 15, but only 3 feet high. You had to lift a cover up to get into the water tanks. You could only enter the crawl space from one side of the house. It was a 2x2 door that we kept a master lock on, but we never actually locked it. Our dog Brewster's area was on this side of the house as well. He had a big fenced area, his own stairway and porch which was half covered, and he had a doghouse. Brewster was a Weimaraner chocolate lab mix who weighed 130 pounds. He was a fantastic dog who barked only when necessary. During the summer, we had black bears in our yard most nights, and Brewster would give them a quick bark to get them on their way. We knew those kinds of barks. There are 4 of us in my family. My parents, myself, and my older brother, who is 2 years older and has Down syndrome. My brother was in special education at school, and there were other kids who would come into the same room, but just once in a while throughout the day, because they had a similar disability and were able to keep up in some of the general classes, but some of the kids had discipline problems or mental illness. My brother was loved by the kids in school, and everyone knew him. One day, a native kid that was about 15 came to our door and wanted to play with Travis. We thought it was odd because Travis has moderate Downs, and he didn't really like playing with other kids. He liked watching the other kids play. Travis likes watching movies and listening to music. My mom asked the kid what his name was, and he said his name was Mark. He knew Travis from junior high the year prior because he would go into Travis's class sometimes for help with his schoolwork. I remembered him staring at me a little too much, and he didn't seem like someone who was mentally challenged. My mom let him come in but kept a watchful eye on him. Travis seemed like he didn't want him there, and my mom told Mark we were having dinner soon and told him it was time for him to go. My mom found out he had moved into the area where we lived, but it was still a little ways away. He had been in and out of foster care most of his life, and his parents were abusive addicts. I think he also came over one other time, and my mom felt bad for him, but she felt like something was off. She felt like he was coming over because of me. My mom politely told him that Travis didn't really like having visitors. He seemed okay with that and never came over again. My parents went to a church service on Wednesday evenings and would always be gone for a couple of hours. I would stay home with Travis. At the time, I was 11 and he was 13. I started to help out in the church nursery when I was 9, and when I turned 11, my best friends and I took a babysitting course, which included CPR and first aid. We would often babysit together, and at age 12, we all started babysitting on our own. My mom was a homemaker and was always home except for Wednesday church service. My parents didn't drink, do drugs, smoke, anything like that. Honestly, I can only remember my parents going out a few times where we needed a babysitter. I would leave the downstairs door unlocked for my parents when they were only going to be gone a couple of hours. I was expecting them home in half an hour, so I was very surprised when I suddenly heard the downstairs door open. I thought I must not have heard the car pull up, and Travis was past his bedtime, so I quietly told him to go to his bedroom and get into bed. I start walking through the kitchen to the top of the stairs, and I call out, "Mom? Dad?" I hear the footsteps stop. I'm looking down the stairs, and I can see men's work boots and jeans. This wasn't my parents. The way the steps were set up, you could only see the bottom half of someone without descending the stairs. I was scared to death, and I ran up to Travis, who was going down the hall. I grabbed him and dragged him into my parents' bedroom because it was the only room that locks, has a phone, and has rifles. And Downs kids are very stubborn, so my brother just wanted to go to his room, but finally I got him to sit down on the bed. I was trying to keep him inside while grabbing a gun, trying to call my neighbor. I could hear the person downstairs still. My neighbor answered her phone immediately, and I whispered, "Someone is in my house. I'm scared." She told me to come out onto the front porch and she'd be there waiting. I get the courage and run to the door and get outside. Thankfully, she was in our driveway, and she had brought her hound dog with her. She lets me know that she's going to enter the house through the downstairs. She disappears from my sight, but comes back quickly and tells me that the door is locked, so she makes her way up the stairs. She gets to the top when we hear the downstairs door open and the crunching of gravel as the intruder was running off. She lets go of her dog's leash. The dog chased the person into the woods. It came back 10 minutes later, and our neighbor sat with us until my parents got home. The police were never called, because I think my parents assumed it was a neighbor boy screwing with me. We lived in a safe place, where you only had to worry about bears and the occasional wolf. A week after this incident, our dog would bark 15 minutes after we went to bed, every single night. We would look out the windows and never saw anything. We figured it was bears because it was springtime, and Brewster was probably just getting used to them again. After a couple of months, though, the barking still happened. I had my best friend stay the night, and we would always stay in the downstairs so we could be louder and stay up as late as we'd like. Kate had a brother that was 7 years older, and we asked if he'd bring us some booze. I know, we were young, but that was the normal thing for our town. Kids started drinking, smoking, and having sex in middle school, mostly because of boredom, I think. We got 13 feet of rain a year, so we would be trapped inside a lot. It was a little after midnight, and her brother never showed up. Brewster never barked that night either. We were sitting on the stairs braiding each other's hair, and we both got a feeling like someone was looking at us. We looked over and saw a man was staring into the window. We ran up the stairs in a panic. We thought maybe it was her brother, but he wouldn't have come to the window to spy on us, and the face seemed too dark to be his. But we had the lights on in the downstairs area, and there were no lights by that outside window, so it was hard to tell who it was. We didn't wake my parents up just in case it was her brother. We waited 30 minutes, went back down to grab our stuff, and went to sleep in my bedroom for the night. The next day we talked to her brother, and we found out it for sure wasn't him. That night, Brewster was back to barking once again. 2 more months go by. I had gone to bed and heard Brewster bark. I looked out my window, and as usual, I didn't see anything. I had just dozed back off when I heard Brewster start barking more frantically. I look out my window, only to see a guy running out of our driveway. I thought about waking my parents, but we had a trail on the side of our house that kids used to get to the road behind us. The neighborhood was on the side of a mountain as well, so all of the kids used trails to go straight through to another road, instead of using the main roads. I had never seen someone out on the other part of the driveway because the trail was on the south side of the house, along with the crawl space and Brewster's area. My room was the only room on the north side. I decided to go back to sleep, but as I was tossing and turning, 15 minutes go by and I start to smell smoke. When I get to the hall, the smell is a lot stronger and is starting to get hazy in Travis's room, which was directly across from mine. I scream, "Fire! Fire! Everyone wake up!" My parents were up, and Travis didn't want to get out of bed, but thank God for the strength of adrenaline. We get outside, and flames are just pouring out of the crawl space. We get Brewster out of his enclosure, and the neighbors all come out to help us. The firemen got there rather quickly as well, but by the time they did, the fire had destroyed the crawl space, my parents' and Travis's bedrooms, because they were directly over it. The firemen got the fire put out quickly, thankfully, and nobody was physically hurt. This was one of the scariest nights of my life, though. I'll always remember the fire chief kneeling down to speak to me after he had talked to my parents. He said, "Melinda, we believe it was arson." I was young, so I looked at him with tears streaming down my face and said in anger, "Who is arson?" Everyone started laughing. I was sitting there thinking, how is this funny? That damn arson could have killed my family. So he sat there and explained to me what arson was. I'm still friends with the old fire chief's son, and I share that story with him often, because his father passed away from cancer when we were teens. Honestly, his father is the only happy memory I have of that horrific night. The island I grew up on had a city and a village out south. We lived out south, but before the village. We had firemen for out south, north, and the city. We had state troopers for the inland, and city cops for the city limits. My mom took my brother and I to our family friend's house, whilst my dad dealt with the fire officials and a state trooper who showed up later. After the investigation, my family, neighbors, and firemen pieced together that a person had been living in our crawl space for at least 4 months. We know he set the house on fire on purpose because he had used a box of matches. My mom said the first odd thing she noticed that night was the smell of sulfur. We also happened to know who did it. It turns out it was Mark. His uncle was one of the firemen who showed up at our house first and saw him standing near our driveway watching. My mother had told him my description of what the person was wearing that I saw fleeing from our house, and that was the exact same outfit he was still in. Behind our house near the crawlspace area, my dad found where he hung out when he wasn't in the crawlspace. There were tons of cigarette butts, cans of soda, which were also found in the crawlspace. But because it wasn't locked, our insurance company wouldn't have paid for the repairs. This is because the space with our water tanks was always supposed to be locked. So my parents never said anything to the police, and the firemen never said anything either. By pursuing this, we could have not had a home, a house that my father had built. It took 4 months for our house to be repaired, and it smelled like ozone even years later. What bothers me the most is knowing he had seen me and my friends undressed numerous times whilst changing in the rec room during tons of sleepovers. Where he had set up shop was right next to the plywood, with the holes drilled through. He listened in to all our secrets. I never explained to my friends that he had seen and heard us during our sleepovers, mostly because I didn't want them to feel sick to their stomachs like I did, and still do. I still have issues when it comes to being home alone. I can't sleep if I'm the only adult in the house. I keep the volume on everything very low. I'm scared to shower. I like to be able to see out the front door, and I have night terrors to this day. I'm 34 now. I've been dealing with anxiety since the fire, and panic attacks since I was 18. Just recently, I was diagnosed with PTSD. When the intruder was in his early 20s, he was also later caught for burning down a few houses and was put into jail. My childhood toys were all stored in that crawl space, along with a lot of our family's sentimental possessions. I hope this was an easy read. I've been dealing with a possible neurological condition for the past year, and I lose my train of thought easily, so I struggle to find words that are simple. When I was about 16, 9 years ago, I was living with my family in a suburban area outside of LA. It was a nice neighborhood. Kids rode their bikes in a group, parents waved to each other, and helped keep an eye on people's houses, and you could join a barbecue just by walking by at the right time. Well, my dad was working nights at a hospital in the city, so that left myself, my mom who was 36, my sister who was 12, and my brother, who was 8, home at night from 6:30 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. the next day. One night we were just cooking, listening to music, and just all around having a good night. Everyone was in bed by 9 o'clock. Suddenly, I'm woken up to the sound of our front door being rattled, and my mom calling out for my dad like he was home. Our house is laid out like this. There's a front door and a small entryway, and the right side wall, facing the door from outside, was my brother's room. Myself and my sister were on the other side of him, and the doorway led to our dining room. My mom's room was off from the living room towards the back of the house, so they typically turned on lights to come by our rooms. It wasn't all that uncommon for my dad to get let off a shift a few hours early and end up home before 7. Our front door was frosted glass in the middle that was clear enough so that we could see whoever was at the front door. It was old and a little off, so typically you had to put a little force into opening the door, even if it was completely unlocked. This part my mom later filled me in. She had gotten up, also hearing the door, and thought my dad was home the same as I did. However, upon calling out for my dad to confirm and turning on the light switch, whoever it was at the front door froze and noticeably jumped. She had still been walking closer to the door to open it to help him, still half asleep, when she realized the man in the doorway was as tall as my dad, but he had a full head of hair, as well as his outline not matching the familiar one of my dad coming home in scrubs. This man was wider than my dad, and once he could see my mom in the doorway, he started not only turning the knob, but throwing himself against the frosted glass. I don't know what kept me from rolling over and going back to bed, but in the next few moments, I heard my mom scream. I sat up in time to hear her footsteps and see her as she disappeared into her bedroom, only to come out with the revolver my dad had bought her for her birthday. At this point, I had rolled over and checked my cell phone quickly to see it was 1:30 in the morning. I dialed 911 while my mom was pointing the gun at whoever was at the door trying to force their way inside. "Stop or I'll shoot you. I'm on the phone with the police and they're on their way already, so I will use force if you enter my home." My mom was screaming at the huge man at the door, who after hearing her the second and third time, finally took a step back. He just stared at our shapes from the other side of the frosted glass. After a moment's thought, he seemed to like his chances because he stepped forward once again and only ran once my mom pulled the pin back and repeated what she had been saying, adding that she might decide not even to wait for him to be inside. The man ran off, as I mentioned, and I stayed on the phone with 911 as my mom stood in the doorway. Her gun still clutched in both her hands, aimed at the door the way Dad had taught her to hold it just the weekend before, when we'd all gone off to the range. It was only a moment after the man had fled that 2 uniformed officers filled the doorway he had just been in. When they knocked, I finally realized just how terrified my mother was, because she didn't even respond to them identifying themselves. Her voice shook as she told the officers that she had a weapon, but that she wanted to hear their badge numbers before she would open the door, so I could confirm with the dispatcher. Once they did, she opened the revolver and unloaded it, putting it on the table and crying as I opened the door for the police. They took our statements, had several patrol cars out looking, and found him a few hours later 6 blocks from our home. At that point, he'd made it into a residence he was trying to break into, and they caught him in the middle of robbing the retired couple he had knocked unconscious. When I was in 8th through 10th grade, I was extremely involved in a small Minecraft building server. The average age was probably 15 to 17, and I joined a group of builders and Skyped with them every weekend for hours. We all became close very fast, and trusted each other enough that we all followed each other on Instagram. I became particularly close with one of the builders in my friend group, named Peter. Peter was in the same grade as me, and we ended up texting quite a lot. I heard rumors that Peter might have a crush on me. He denied them, of course, which I found laughable because it was the internet, so I brushed it off. Everything was fine for a while, until something began to feel off whenever I talked to him. I was starting to constantly catch him telling small lies. This bothered me, so I figured it was time to distance myself from Peter, and I stopped talking to him for a while. And cut to a few months later of no contact, when Peter out of the blue texts me, saying that he's going to be possibly transferring to my high school so he can get in-state tuition for college. Peter's plan was to somehow live completely alone and support himself while in high school. My stomach dropped when I read the text, and I knew this felt very, very off. I tried to be calm. I told him that his plan was crazy. I told him it's oddly convenient that he also chose my random suburb. Peter insists that this plan will work, and it's just a coincidence that he's going to my high school. I'm trying to call Peter's bluff, and hoping he's just screwing with me because I suddenly cut him off. Then, Peter says he already bought the plane tickets, and is going to stay in my town and visit some high school in the area. Fear washes over me, and I realize Peter definitely has some very unhealthy attachment to me. He was not bluffing. To my horror, he later posts a picture on Snapchat of him at the airport. He asked me to meet up with him while he's there, and of course I decline. Later, I see on his Snapchat story that he's taking a tour of my high school. Peter is taking lots of videos and pictures, probably hoping that I could see. Luckily though, I was stuck at home with pneumonia. I spent the next few days on edge, afraid he was going to ring my doorbell at any moment. Luckily he was not smart enough to find where I live. He flew home and didn't follow through with his plan. The baffling part was, none of my old group on the Minecraft server thought he was doing anything creepy. I feel like I was going crazy for thinking this was weird. I thought my rejection of this meetup and continued no contact would be the end of it once and for all, but about 2 years later, I had just committed to my dream college. I still stupidly followed Peter on social media because I wanted some kind of warning if he ever came to my area. Once again, Peter did. I see him posing in front of the library at my college with a caption saying, "Transferring here is definitely the move." Cut to a few months later. He finds out I had a boyfriend and directly contacts me for the first time in over 2 years. He starts out asking strange questions like, "Will he protect you?" I shouldn't have answered, but for some reason I did. I finally blocked him and stopped following him on social media out of fear. So far since then, he hasn't tried to contact me since. I know I definitely made some mistakes because I was young and scared, and had lots of others telling me it wasn't a big deal.